Give me that food box, I'll give you something far more valuable. Richard Whitmore spoke, then placed a bank card and a thick stack of cash on the wooden plank beside Annie. She froze. Her eyes rested on the money for several seconds before slowly moving to the man standing in front of her. You want this food box? Richard nodded. Yes, I want that box. Annie tightened both hands around the faded blue handle. Her fingers, coated with white cement dust, pressed tightly together. But it is not worth anything, sir. That does not matter. Richard glanced at the old closed lid. I have not eaten since this morning. I am very hungry. Annie looked at him, surprise clearly written across her face. You are really that hungry? Yes. She hesitated. Richard's white shirt remained crisp despite the harsh midday sun beating down on the construction site. His watch caught the light whenever he moved. Even his shoes were cleaner than anything Annie was wearing. You are dressed so nicely, she said quietly. The food I brought is not good enough for you. Not far away, two workers sitting beside a stack of lumber had stopped talking. Earl Maddox wiped the sweat from his face with the red cloth around his neck and gave a dry laugh. She is acting like there is gold in that box, he said. The man says he is hungry, and she keeps asking questions. Pete Lawson looked toward Richard. Mr. Whitmore, you should not eat whatever is inside that old box. We can call the food truck back. They have pulled pork, grilled chicken, anything you want. Earl pointed at the lunchbox in Annie's hands. There is probably nothing inside except a crushed sandwich and an apple left over from last week. Pete laughed with him. You own an entire row of buildings in Atlanta. You do not need to eat food from a dented old box like that. Annie lowered her eyes. They were not speaking very loudly, but nearly everyone resting nearby could hear them. A few workers turned to look. Some remained silent. Some smirked. Others appeared uncomfortable, but said nothing. Heat rose from the concrete and closed around Annie's legs. Dust covered her sleeves. Sweat had dried into pale streaks along her neck and back. She knew what the box looked like. Most of the blue paint had peeled away from the corners. One side had a deep dent from the day it fell from a bus. Near the handle, the letters JC had been carved with the point of a knife years earlier. Her father's initials. Annie washed the box every night. She scrubbed the dirt from every narrow seam, but no amount of soap could make it look new again. Richard did not look at Earl or Pete. He continued watching Annie. What did you bring? She swallowed hard. Just a sandwich, an apple, and some water. That sounds fine. It is peanut butter and jelly. I have eaten peanut butter and jelly before. Annie looked at the money again. There was more cash on the wooden plank than she had ever held at one time. Only part of it would be enough to pay the electric bill with the red notice taped to the refrigerator. It could cover the overdue rent before the landlord came knocking again. It could pay for all the medicine waiting behind the pharmacy counter, where the pharmacist was holding it because Annie had not been able to pay the full amount. The bank card rested on top of the cash. Richard had not said how much money was on it, but Annie knew it was worth far more than one poor lunch. Earl shook his head. Now she is being selfish. If someone is hungry and asks for food, just give it to him. Why stand there acting like this is some major business deal? Pete added. Especially when he is offering enough money to buy her 100 lunches. Annie's cheeks burned. She wanted to say that she had not eaten anything that morning. She wanted to explain that the sandwich had to keep her standing through the afternoon shift and another 4 hours washing glasses and wiping tables at Rosie's Cafe. She wanted to tell them that the night before, she had eaten only one leftover cookie after closing, then gone home and lied to her mother that she had shared a full meal with her coworkers. But Annie knew that when poor people explained themselves, others rarely listened to understand. They listened to judge. They asked where the money had gone, why she had not found a better job, why she had not asked relatives for help, and how she had allowed her life to become so difficult. When poverty was explained in front of strangers, it stopped being a circumstance. It became something for others to inspect. So Annie said nothing. Richard pushed the bank card and the cash closer to her. Well, he asked, do you agree? Before Annie could answer, Earl stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, forget that box. Pete and I can get you real food. There is a steakhouse 10 minutes from here. Whatever you want, we can bring it. Pete nodded quickly. Or I can call the diner near Highway 16. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, butter biscuits. You do not need whatever that girl brought. Earl glanced at Annie. Maybe this is the best meal she has ever had. That must be why she is holding on to it so tightly. A few workers turned away, But Earl continued, seeming to enjoy the attention more with every word. Come on, Annie. What is inside? Caviar? A 5-course meal packed into that tiny rusted box? Pete laughed. Maybe she thinks the sandwich is worth more than all that money. Earl moved closer. Or maybe it is the most valuable thing she has ever owned. Look at the way she is holding it. Maybe she has never had anything better in her life. Annie's fingers tightened around the handle until they hurt. Please stop, she said. Her voice was so quiet that it was almost swallowed by the machinery in the distance. Earl did not stop. You hear that, Mr. Whitmore? She wants you to pay for the privilege of eating a cheap sandwich. I did not say that. Annie's voice began to tremble. Pete shrugged, then handed over. You are making something simple more difficult than it needs to be. I said stop. This time, her voice broke. Earl smiled as though her pain had proved him right. Look at her. She is about to cry over one little lunch. You would think she was protecting a family treasure. Annie lowered her head. A tear fell onto the back of her hand before she could wipe it away. She turned her face aside, hoping no one would notice. But another tear slid down her dust-streaked cheek. Annie pulled the food box closer to her chest. Not because it was worth more than her mother's medicine. Not because she valued the sandwich more than the money in front of her. It was simply the only meal she had for the entire day. And the box was the last thing she still had from her father. Richard turned toward Earl. That is enough. His voice was not loud, but the smile disappeared from Earl's face at once. I was only saying, I have heard enough. Earl stepped back. Richard looked at Annie. The tears on her face disturbed him in a way he had not expected. He had only meant to test her. The site manager had told him that Annie was the poorest worker there. During the day, she cleared rubble. At night, she worked at a cafe to pay for her mother's medicine. Richard had wanted to know whether, when faced with money, she would trade away the little food she had. But he had not considered that the test would unfold in front of so many people. He had not expected those two men to use Annie's poverty as an excuse to crush her dignity. And worst of all, he was the one who had put her in that position. Richard pushed the cash toward Annie one more time. You can take all of it, he said. The card too. I only want the box. Annie looked at the money. Her breathing became uneven. In her mind, she saw the pharmacy counter again, with bottles labeled in her mother's name. She saw the electric bill. She remembered the landlord pounding on the door, and her mother saying they could endure the cold for a few more days if they still did not have enough money. All she had to do was hand over the box, and everything could change immediately. But Richard had said he was hungry. Annie lifted her head. If I give it to you, she asked, will you really eat what is inside? Richard hesitated. Yes. Will you eat all of it? If I can. You will not open it and laugh because the food is too poor? Richard was silent for a moment. No. And you are not doing this so everyone can laugh at me? Richard glanced at Earl and Pete. No, he said. I am not. Annie studied his face as though trying to decide whether the answer was true. Then she released one hand from the handle and wiped away her tears with the back of it. The sandwich inside had been made before sunrise in the small kitchen she shared with her mother. Annie had spread the peanut butter very thin so there would be enough left for the next day. The apple had been given to her by a shopkeeper because it had already begun to soften. Annie understood hunger. She knew it was not only the sound of an empty stomach, it was the dizziness that came when she stood too quickly. It was hands trembling halfway through a shift. It was going to bed early, so she would not have to think about food. She understood hunger better than bank cards, investment accounts, or men who stepped out of luxury cars with assistants walking behind them. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice from the years they had spent sitting together at their small kitchen table. Help offered in exchange for gain was only a transaction. Food given to someone who was hungry was kindness. Annie stepped closer to the wooden plank. She placed the food box beside the money. Then, in front of everyone, she gently pushed the bank card and the entire stack of cash back toward Richard. Earl stopped laughing. Pete opened his mouth but could not speak. Richard looked down at the money, then at Annie. She lifted the box again and offered it to him with both hands. You do not need to pay me, sir. Her voice still trembled, but every word was clear. If you are hungry, please eat. Richard did not reach for it. You said that is all you brought. Yes, sir. Then what will you eat this afternoon? Annie tried to smile, though tears still clung to her lashes. I will be fine. That is not an answer. The small smile disappeared. Annie lowered her voice. Nothing. Richard looked at her. Until when? Until after my evening shift. If the cafe has leftovers, they may let me take some home. Richard's expression changed. And if there are no leftovers? Annie lowered her eyes. I will drink water and go to sleep. What about your mother? I left food for her. You are going hungry so she can eat? Annie did not answer. Her silence said everything. She continued holding the food box out toward Richard. I cannot take this money just for feeding you, she said. My mother taught me that kindness stops being kindness when we put a price on it. Richard looked at her for a long time. But this money could buy your mother's medicine. I know. It could pay the rent. I know. It could keep you from working 2 jobs every day. Annie's eyes reddened again. I know. Then why are you still refusing? Annie looked directly at him. If you are truly hungry, I do not want you to have to buy my kindness. The entire break area fell silent. Annie continued, her voice tightening with emotion. And if you are only testing me, then I do not want to trade what my mother taught me for money. Richard could not speak. She moved the food box closer. Please eat. I can endure being hungry for one more afternoon. You still have to work under this sun. I will drink water. You could faint. Annie gave a small nod. Maybe. And you would still give it to me? Because you said you were hungry. Richard looked at the old food box in her hands. Then he looked at the 18-year-old girl with dusty shoes, a sunburned face, and hands roughened by hard labor. A girl who had almost nothing. Yet she was still willing to give away everything she had. Richard slowly reached out. Annie thought he was going to take the box, so she loosened her fingers. But he did not take it. Instead, he placed his palm beneath both of Annie's hands and carefully pushed the box back toward her. No, he said. His voice had dropped. You keep it. Confusion crossed Annie's face. But you said you were hungry. I am. Then why will you not eat? Richard looked at the scratched initials JC near the handle. Whose box is this? Annie lowered her eyes. My father's. Where is he? He passed away, sir. Richard went still. Annie pulled the box close to her body. This is the last thing I have left from him. And you were still willing to give it to me? You were not taking the box forever. You only needed the food inside. Richard turned away for a moment. When he looked back at Annie, his eyes had changed. He looked at the bank card and the stack of cash he had just used to measure a person he barely knew. Then he looked at Earl and Pete, who no longer dared to raise their heads. Finally, he looked back at Annie. You have already given me what I wanted, Richard said. Richard's words made Annie pull the lunchbox closer to her chest. She could not tell whether the exchange had ended or had simply shifted into another form she did not yet understand. The stack of cash and the bank card still lay on the wooden plank between them. They no longer looked like an offer. They looked like proof that, only minutes earlier, her kindness had been weighed and measured in front of dozens of people. Earl and Pete stood several yards away. Neither of them was laughing anymore. The workers nearby had returned to their paper bags and plastic containers, but their movements were slower now. A few pretended to focus on their food. Others glanced over and quickly looked away whenever they met Richard's eyes. He turned toward Earl and Pete. A minute ago, the two of you had plenty to say. Richard's voice was not loud, but it was enough to silence the entire lunch area. Now say it to her. Earl cleared his throat and forced an awkward smile. Mr. Whitmore, we were only joking. Richard looked directly at him. I did not ask what you were doing. He pointed toward Annie. I told you to speak to her. Pete looked down at his dust-covered boots. Sorry. Richard did not respond. He remained still and waited. Pete was forced to raise his head. I'm sorry, Annie. I should not have said those things. Earl shifted his weight, his discomfort plain on his face. Me too. Annie looked at them. She did not see genuine remorse in Earl's eyes. She saw only embarrassment at being forced to apologize in front of everyone. She gave a small nod. All right. Richard studied her face. You do not have to accept an apology simply because someone finally agrees to give one. Annie tightened her fingers around the handle of the lunchbox. I know. Then why did you say it was all right? She glanced toward the clock mounted on the site office. Because I do not want to spend the rest of my break talking about this. The answer left Richard silent for a moment. It was not her forgiveness that caught his attention. It was the way Annie was trying to reclaim the few quiet minutes she had left in a day that had already demanded too much from her. He turned toward Daniel. How much break time is left? Daniel checked his watch. 7 minutes. Richard looked across the site. Groups of workers sat beneath scaffolding, beside stacks of lumber, or against unfinished concrete walls. Some had finished eating long ago. Others were carefully sharing bottles of water so they would last through the afternoon. A few had nothing but dry bread or a bag of potato chips. Give them an hour. Victor stepped forward immediately. Richard, the concrete trucks will be here in 20 minutes. Reschedule them. That will cost us money. Richard turned toward him. So will having workers collapse from heat exhaustion. Victor lowered his voice, though everyone nearby could still hear him. We cannot stop a project this large because one worker brought a small lunch. Annie's expression changed. She looked down at the lunchbox, as though his words had once again pushed all the attention back onto her. Richard noticed, this is not only about one lunch. He turned toward Claire. Call the barbecue restaurant near the highway. Order enough food for the entire site. Chicken, pulled pork, beans, coleslaw, cornbread, fruit, bottled water, and iced tea. Claire already had her phone out. For the entire site? Everyone. There are more than 200 workers. Then order for 250. Victor ran a hand across his mouth, trying to remain calm. You have a call with the lenders in 15 minutes. Move it. Claire looked up from her screen. They will not be happy. Richard looked at the workers sitting beneath the sun. They will survive. Whispers began spreading through the crowd. Daniel turned his face away to hide a smile. Richard looked back at Annie. You are done working for today. She immediately tightened her hold on the lunchbox. Sir, I can still work. I did not say you could not. Then why are you sending me home? Because Daniel told me you nearly fainted here 2 weeks ago, and because you just admitted that you would not eat anything until tonight. Annie turned toward Daniel. Her expression was not angry, but it was hurt. Daniel lowered his voice. Annie, I was only worried about you. She looked back at Richard. That does not mean I have to leave. It means you need food and rest. I need the hours. You will still be paid for the full day. Annie looked at Daniel again. Can he do that? Daniel folded his arms. He signs the checks. Annie did not look relieved. I do not want special treatment. Richard answered at once. Neither do I. I want a worker who can finish the week without collapsing onto the concrete. I will not collapse. You almost did before. That time was different. How? Annie opened her mouth, then stopped. She could have told him that her mother had suffered severe pain in the middle of the night, and Annie had spent the week's food money on medicine. She could have explained that she had worked 2 shifts in a row and arrived at the construction site after only 2 hours of sleep. But every explanation felt like peeling back another private part of her life in front of strangers. She did not want to do that. Richard noticed her hesitation and lowered his voice. I am not asking you to take the money. Annie looked at the cash still resting on the plank. But everything happening now makes it feel that way. What does? She raised her head. You found out I was poor. You brought out money to test me in front of everyone. Then, once you learned about my situation, you decided what I needed and started giving orders. Claire looked at Richard. Victor fell silent too. Everyone waited to see whether he would become angry. Richard did not defend himself. You are right. Annie paused. Perhaps she had expected an argument, an explanation that he had only meant well, or a reminder of who owned the site. Instead, Richard simply stood in front of her and admitted it. I handled this badly. If Annie's kindness and courage touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories. Annie said nothing. Richard continued. Then tell me what I need to do to make it less wrong. She looked toward the work crews, the site office, and then the road beyond the gate. Do not cut my hours. Agreed. Do not use my name in any company publicity. Agreed. No photographs. Agreed. And do not send anyone to my home unless my mother gives permission. Richard glanced at Claire. We can call first. Annie's eyes narrowed immediately. Call about what? Doctor. Her expression changed completely. She turned toward Daniel. You told him about my mother? Daniel stepped forward. I only said she was ill. You should not have. Annie, I only wanted... I know why you said it. Her voice was not raised, but it hardened. But it was still my story to tell. Daniel fell silent. Then he nodded. You are right, Richard said. No one will come to your home without your mother's permission. Claire can arrange an appointment at a clinic instead. Annie looked at him cautiously. We do not have insurance. The company can pay for the visit. Her eyes moved at once to the bank card. I told you I do not want your money. This is not payment for your lunch, but it still comes from you. Yes. Then what do you call it? Richard did not answer immediately. He looked around the construction site at the workers using their short break to divide water and food among themselves. Making something right. Annie frowned. Making what right? The fact that someone can work 2 jobs, one of them for my company, and still have to choose between eating and buying medicine. Victor let out a sharp breath. She does not work both jobs for us. Richard turned toward him. Is that the only thing you heard? Victor went silent. Annie watched them, then looked down at the dented lunchbox in her hands. She gently ran her thumb over the initials near the handle. "One appointment," she said. "My mother will decide whether she wants to go." Richard nodded. "One appointment. No reporters. No. No photographs. No. No company employees coming to ask questions. No one." Claire began entering the information into her phone. "I need a number where we can reach her." Annie hesitated for a long time. It was the only phone number she and her mother had. The old phone often died in the middle of the day, and one corner of the screen was cracked. Reading the number aloud to a stranger still felt like opening another door into their private lives. At last, she recited it slowly. Claire repeated it back to confirm, then saved it. 40 minutes later, 2 small delivery trucks pulled into the construction site. Folding tables were set up in a shaded area. Aluminum trays, paper plates, plastic forks, bottled water, and ice-filled coolers quickly covered the tables. The smell of barbecue spread across the site. Workers began arriving from every section. At first, they approached cautiously, but once Daniel announced that the meal was for everyone, the line quickly grew. Richard stayed. He missed the call with the lenders. Then he postponed his afternoon flight as well. Annie sat at the end of a long table beside Daniel. Her lunchbox remained closed and rested close to her feet, as though she feared someone might ask her to give it up again. She did not stand to get food right away. Only after every work crew had been called, and even the workers from the farthest section had received a plate, did she slowly walk toward the table. Daniel looked at her. "Why did you not go first?" Annie held the paper plate with both hands. "I wanted to make sure everyone had enough." "There is plenty." "I know." Even so, she looked over the remaining trays before taking only a small portion. Pete approached, carrying 2 bottles of water. He placed one near Annie. "Whatever my apology meant to you earlier, I want to say again that I truly am sorry." Annie looked at the bottle, then at him. "Then next time, stop before someone more powerful has to tell you to." Pete nodded. "You are right." He did not remain there waiting for forgiveness. He simply turned and returned to his seat. Earl did not approach Annie. He sat at another table with his head lowered, barely speaking to anyone. Richard stood in line for food with everyone else. There was no private table, no special plate. When Victor tried to bring him a separate meal, Richard handed it back. "I will wait in line." "That is not necessary." "It is to me." He stood behind a group of electricians, holding the same paper plate as everyone else. After lunch, Claire approached Annie with a small card. "The clinic appointment is tomorrow morning," she said. "Transportation is available if your mother agrees to go. If she refuses, no one will call again to pressure her or come to your home." Annie accepted the card with both hands. "Thank you. Richard wants to speak with you before you leave the site." Annie immediately became cautious. "About what?" "Ayoub." She looked toward Richard. He was standing beside the site office with his sleeves rolled up. An older welder stood in front of him, pointing toward the temporary rest area and complaining about the lack of shade. Richard was not checking his watch. He was not interrupting either. For the first time that day, he was simply standing there and listening. Annie opened the lunchbox, placed the clinic card inside, and carefully closed the lid. "What kind of job?" she asked. Claire gave a small smile. "One that does not involve carrying broken concrete." Annie held the box against her chest. Then he should be prepared to explain himself clearly. "Explain what?" "Why he thinks I can do it." Claire studied her for a moment. "Perhaps that is exactly what he is waiting for you to ask." Richard waited beside the site trailer while the last of the lunch tables were being cleared. He had removed his tie and folded it into his jacket pocket. Annie approached with the blue food box tucked under one arm. Claire remained nearby with her tablet. Daniel stood a few steps away, close enough to listen but far enough to let Annie speak for herself. Richard pointed toward the trailer. "Would you sit down for a few minutes?" Annie looked through the open door. The air conditioner hummed inside, and several project maps covered the walls. "I can stand." "All right." Richard leaned against the edge of a desk. "Claire tells me you want to know why I think you can do the job." "I do. You show up on time. Daniel says you remember instructions after hearing them once. You notice when equipment is left in the wrong place, and you've corrected delivery counts more than once." Annie turned toward Daniel. "You told him all that?" "I told him what I've seen." Richard continued. "The project office needs a paid trainee, data entry, timesheets, safety documents, purchase records. Claire would train you." Annie waited for him to explain the part he was leaving out. "How long?" 30 days to start. "And after 30 days? If you do the work well, We discuss a permanent position. If I don't, you return to the labor crew, assuming you still want to. Annie looked down at the dust on her boots. I've never worked in an office. That's why it's called training. I don't know the software. You can learn it. You don't know that. No, Richard said. I don't. That's what the 30 days are for. His answer was direct enough to surprise her. Claire stepped closer. The position includes a regular schedule, a higher hourly rate, and access to the company health plan after the probation period. Annie looked at her. For my mother too? Dependents can be added if the employment requirements are met. She isn't my dependent on paper. We can review the rules. Annie's shoulders stiffened. So this is about the lunch. Richard answered before Claire could. The lunch made me pay attention. It doesn't qualify you for a job. Then what does? Your record here. I clean debris. You also catch mistakes. That doesn't mean I can work in there. Annie nodded toward the trailer. Richard studied her. Are you saying you can't? Or are you saying you don't want people watching you try? Her eyes narrowed. You think I'm afraid? I think you've had to protect yourself for a long time. That isn't an answer. No, he said. It's an observation. Annie shifted the food box beneath her arm. People already think I got a free meal because you felt sorry for me. What do you think they'll say if I walk into that office tomorrow? Daniel spoke from behind her. They'll say whatever lets them avoid looking at their own work. Annie turned. You don't have to hear it all day. No, Daniel said, but I've heard my share. She knew what he meant. Daniel had spent years moving through jobs where men with less experience questioned his authority before they followed it. Richard said, I can't promise people will be fair. Then what can you promise? A written job description, a standard trainee wage, clear performance reviews, no publicity, no photographs, no interviews. If you succeed, the record will show why. And if someone decides I don't fit, Claire will supervise you. Claire raised an eyebrow. That sounded more flattering in your head. Richard almost smiled. She will also document your work. Annie looked between them. I need time to think. How much? Until tomorrow. Richard checked the clock on the wall. Tomorrow morning. No, tomorrow afternoon. Why? Because I'm taking my mother to the clinic in the morning. Claire nodded. The appointment is at 9. Richard said, tomorrow afternoon then. Annie turned to leave, but he stopped her. One more thing. She faced him. If you accept, you stop working the night shift at the cafe during the 30 days. That isn't your decision. It affects whether you can do the job. The cafe pays me. So would this. The cafe is certain. Your offer isn't. Richard took a breath. Then, keep the cafe for the first week. After that, we review it. I'm not promising to quit. I'm not asking for a promise. Annie gave him a cautious nod and stepped outside. Daniel followed her toward the gate. You're going to say no, he said. I didn't say that. You have the look. What look? The one you get when someone offers help and you start searching for the trap. Annie stopped beside the supply shed. You think there isn't one? I think every opportunity has a cost. That doesn't make it a trap. I don't have office clothes. I don't know how to talk in meetings. I don't know half the words they use. You didn't know how to run the debris lift when you started here. That's different. You learned it in 2 days. Annie looked toward the office windows. Through the glass, Victor stood speaking to Richard. Even from a distance, Annie could see the displeasure in his posture. He doesn't want me in there. Daniel followed her gaze. Victor doesn't want anyone in there who asks why. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to make you think. Claire drove Annie home after the site closed. The black company sedan seemed too polished for her street. Annie asked to be dropped at the corner, but Claire continued to the house. If your mother is going to the clinic tomorrow, I need to confirm the address. You could have asked. I just did it badly. Annie glanced at her. Does everyone around Richard apologize that fast? No. Most people around Richard avoid admitting mistakes until a lawyer writes the sentence for them. That earned a small laugh from Annie. Evelyn was seated at the kitchen table when they entered. Several pill bottles stood beside a notebook filled with appointment dates and unpaid amounts. Annie introduced Claire and explained the clinic visit. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When Annie finished, her mother asked, "What does the company want in return?" "Nothing," Claire said. Evelyn looked at her. "Companies always want something. This appointment is not tied to employment." "And the office job?" "That depends on Annie's performance." Evelyn turned to her daughter. "Do you want it?" "I don't know." That means yes, but you're scared to say it. Annie set the food box on the table. I'm not scared. Evelyn lifted one of the empty medicine bottles. You work all day, then serve coffee until midnight. You sleep 4 hours and call it strength. Sometimes fear dresses itself like responsibility. Annie looked away. Claire quietly excused herself and waited outside. Evelyn reached across the table. You have carried this house long enough. I'm not leaving you. I didn't ask you to. What if I fail? Then you fail after trying something better. What if they only see the girl from the cleanup crew? Then make them look twice. The next morning, Annie took Evelyn to the clinic. The doctor adjusted 2 prescriptions, scheduled tests, and arranged a reduced-cost medication program. Nothing was photographed. No company representative entered the examination room. That afternoon, Annie returned to Whitmore Commons. Richard was in the trailer with Claire when she arrived. Victor stood near the filing cabinets. Annie placed the blue food box on the desk. I'll do 30 days, she said. Richard nodded. Good. I have conditions. Victor gave a quiet laugh. Of course she does. Annie turned toward him. Is there a problem? Victor's smile faded. Not yet. She looked back at Richard. Standard pay. Written reviews. No publicity. My mother's care stays separate. If I fail, I hear the reason from Claire, not from rumors. Richard extended his hand. Agreed. Annie shook it. The following morning, she removed her orange vest and hard hat and placed them inside her locker. She did not discard them. She set the blue food box beside them, closed the door, and walked toward the project office. Behind the glass, several employees had already noticed her coming. Annie kept walking. The security guard at the project office looked at Annie's temporary badge, then at her clothes, then back at the badge. You're with cleanup? Project administration trainee. He turned the badge over as though the answer might be printed on the back. 2 office employees passed through the door without being stopped. Who approved this? Claire Monroe. The guard picked up the desk phone. I'm going to verify it. Annie stood beside the entrance while workers moved around her. She had expected questions, but not before she even reached her desk. Claire appeared from the hallway before the call connected. She works here, Mr. Harris. The guard lowered the phone. I was only following procedure. Claire glanced at the 2 employees disappearing around the corner. Then follow it for everyone. Annie clipped the badge to her blouse and entered without commenting. She had chosen the plainest clothes she could afford. Dark slacks, a blue shirt, and flat shoes that pinched near the toes. She missed her work boots already. The office was colder than she expected. Air conditioning moved through the trailer while maps and construction schedules covered the walls. A coffee machine hissed near a cabinet. Phones rang. Keyboards clicked. And people spoke in the quick language of numbers, deadlines, and abbreviations. Claire led her to a desk near the document room. You'll begin with timesheets and delivery logs. Annie looked at the 2 computer monitors. Both of them? One is for the payroll system. The other is for project records. I've never used 2 at once. You will by lunch. Claire handed her a spiral notebook. Write down anything you don't understand. Ask before guessing. If you make an error, tell me before someone else finds it. Annie sat carefully. What if I ask too many questions? Then I'll tell you. A woman at the next desk leaned toward another employee and whispered, That's her. Annie heard it but kept her eyes on the screen. Claire began with the timekeeping program. She showed Annie how to locate employee numbers, contractor codes, shift hours, and overtime approvals. Annie wrote every step by hand. Why are these names yellow? She asked. Temporary workers. And the red marks? Missing information. What happens if it stays missing? Payroll holds the check. Annie looked closer. Even if the worker already did the hours? Yes. That doesn't seem right. It isn't always wrong either. Sometimes the supervisor forgets a code. Annie opened the first file and began entering figures. She moved slowly for the first half hour, then found a rhythm. By 10, she no longer needed Claire to remind her where the menus were. Victor passed her desk twice without speaking. On the 3rd trip, he stopped. How is the experiment going? Annie looked up. The training? If that's what we're calling it. Claire turned from her desk. We're calling it the position named in her contract. Victor smiled. Of course. He placed a stack of folders beside Annie's keyboard. These need to be entered before lunch. Claire looked at the stack. Those are 6 weeks of delivery receipts. She said she learns quickly. Annie examined the first folder. What should I do if the receipt doesn't match the order? Victor had already begun walking away. Enter what's approved. That wasn't what I asked. He stopped and faced her. If the delivery receipt is different from the purchase order, which number do I use? The approved number. Even when the materials didn't arrive? Victor's voice became sharper. You are entering records, Annie. You are not auditing the company. Claire stepped in. Flag the difference and send it to me. Victor looked at Claire. You're encouraging her to question routine paperwork. I'm encouraging accurate records. He left without another word. At noon, Annie opened the blue food box at her desk. Inside were 2 sandwiches, an orange, and a bottle of water. Evelyn had insisted on packing the extra food after the clinic visit. A man from accounting walked past and nodded toward the box. Careful, someone might offer you another bank card. 2 employees laughed. Annie closed the lid. Claire looked up. Do you want me to address that? No. You don't have to ignore it. I don't want every stupid comment turned into a meeting. The man had already moved away, still smiling. Claire said, There's a difference between patience and permission. Annie reopened the box. I know. I'm deciding which one this is. After lunch, she began reviewing timesheets from the previous week. The work seemed simple until she noticed the same employee number appearing under 2 subcontractors. She checked the name, Frank Delaney. Annie knew Frank. He was an older welder who worked on the eastern side and complained about his knees every morning. He had worked more than 50 hours the previous week. The payroll screen showed 40. She checked the gate records. Frank had entered before 7 each morning and left after 6 on 3 days. Annie wrote the figures in her notebook. Then she found another worker with the same problem. And another. By 3 o'clock, she had 11 names. She carried the list to Claire. These hours are missing. Claire reviewed the page. They may have been moved to another project code. Why? Sometimes crews are reassigned. They weren't. I saw them here. Claire opened the payroll system and checked the records herself. You're sure? I worked beside Frank on Tuesday. He was still welding when I left. Claire's expression changed. Save the list. Don't alter anything yet. Victor entered the office as Annie returned to her desk. A few minutes later, Claire called a brief planning meeting. Annie sat near the end of the conference table with her notebook. The discussion moved through concrete schedules, water deliveries, equipment rentals, and labor costs. Annie noticed the outdoor crews were scheduled to receive only 1 water delivery the following day despite the heat forecast. She raised her hand slightly. Victor continued speaking. Annie tried again. Excuse me. He stopped. What? The water order for tomorrow is half the usual amount. We'll manage. The East crew ran out yesterday before 3. Victor looked around the table. Anything else? Annie lowered her hand. A white assistant named Mark studied the schedule, then said, Actually, Victor, we may need to double the water order. The forecast is above 95. Victor nodded. Good catch, Mark. Add another delivery. Annie stared at the figures in her notebook. After the meeting, Richard found her alone near the copying machine. How was your first day? I learned a lot. Are people treating you fairly? Annie thought about the guard, the comments, and Victor praising Mark for the same warning she had given moments earlier. They're treating me carefully, she said. Richard waited. That isn't the same thing. He frowned. What happened? Nothing I can't handle. That's not what I asked. Annie met his eyes. You gave me a chair in that room. Some of them still think I wandered in and sat down by mistake. Before Richard could respond, Claire called Annie back to the desk. The payroll system had finished loading older records. Annie opened the next file. Frank Delaney was not the only worker missing overtime. The same pattern appeared across 3 months, and every adjustment carried the same approval code. Victor Cranes. Annie checked the approval code 3 times before calling Claire over. She did not want to accuse anyone because of one screen or one pattern she did not yet understand. Claire leaned beside the monitor. Show me. Annie opened Frank Delaney's record, then the gate log, then the payroll summary. He worked 53 hours. He was paid for 40. Open the adjustment history. Annie clicked the tab. A line appeared near the bottom. Administrative correction. Claire read. Approved by V. Crane, Annie said. The same code appears on 10 other files. Claire pulled an empty chair closer. Go back another month. They found more. The missing hours did not appear under one crew or one supervisor. They appeared mostly among temporary laborers, older workers, and men who changed assignments during the week. A few hours vanished at a time, rarely enough to draw attention from someone reviewing totals. Annie wrote every name in her notebook. Claire watched her. How did you notice this? I know some of these people. Frank stays late. Luis worked Saturday because his wife was having surgery. Mr. Harlan never leaves before the welding crew locks the cages. You remember everyone's schedule? When you're clearing around them, you learn who is still standing there. Claire opened the project coding system. Some of the hours may have been transferred. To where? That's what we need to find. For the next hour, they followed the missing time through subcontractor numbers and internal project codes. Several entries ended under a labor supplier called South Ridge Staffing. Annie searched the employee list. No workers are assigned to this company. Claire checked again. It may be inactive. Then why is it receiving hours? Claire did not answer. Victor appeared at the end of the aisle. What are you two doing? Reviewing payroll discrepancies, Claire said. I thought that had been settled. It hasn't. Victor stepped behind Annie's chair and looked at the screen. These are routine coding transfers. Annie turned toward him. Transfers to an inactive company? It's not inactive. There are no employees listed. Because Southridge handles administrative distribution, not direct labor. Annie looked back at the records. What does that mean? It means you don't understand the accounting structure. Then explain it. Victor's expression hardened. I don't have time to teach corporate finance to a trainee, Claire said. You have time to identify where the money went. The workers were paid. Not according to these records, Annie replied. Victor placed one hand on the back of her chair. You need to be careful about making accusations. I asked a question. You're suggesting theft. I said the hours are missing. They aren't missing. They were allocated to a company with no workers. Victor turned to Claire. This is exactly what I warned you about. She sees one number she doesn't recognize and decides she has uncovered a crime. Annie stood. She was smaller than Victor, but she did not step away from him. I know what one missing hour costs. Victor gave a humorless smile. That doesn't make you an accountant. No. It makes me someone who checks before taking it from a person's check. Claire closed the payroll screen. We're preserving the records and sending them to finance. Victor reached toward the keyboard. No. You're returning to the work assigned to you. Annie moved her hand over the mouse before he could touch it. The records are already saved. His eyes shifted to her hand. Where? In the document system. Victor looked at Claire. Claire said, standard procedure. He stepped back. Fine. Send your questions to finance. Annie, you will not access closed payroll periods again without written authorization. Why? Because I said so. Claire's voice stayed level. I supervise her. I run this project. And these are company records. Victor walked away without another word, but the speed of his steps made his anger clear. Annie sat down again. Did I go too far? Claire opened a blank email. You asked him where workers' money went. That isn't what I asked. I know. Annie looked toward Victor's office. He's going to find a way to make this my fault. Then we make sure the facts arrive first. They sent the records to corporate finance and copied Richard's legal compliance office. Claire instructed Annie to keep handwritten notes with dates and file numbers. At lunch, Annie carried her food box outside and sat with Daniel near the supply yard. Frank Delaney was eating from a paper bag at the next table. Annie hesitated before approaching him. Mr. Delaney, can I ask you something about last week? Frank folded the top of his bag. Depends whether I'm in trouble. No. Did you work late Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday? He laughed. My knees remember every minute. Were all your hours on your check? His smile disappeared. Why? Please check. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans. My checks are direct deposit. I look at the total. Not every line. Will you look tonight? Daniel watched them carefully. What did you find? Annie sat beside him. Hours are being moved. How many? At least 11 workers so far. Frank leaned closer. Moved where? That's what we're trying to understand. He looked toward the project office. I complained about a short check in March. Payroll told me my supervisor submitted the wrong code. Did they fix it? They added some on the next check. Not all. Do you have the statements? At home. Keep them. Frank's mouth tightened. I'm 2 years from retirement, Annie. I'm not asking you to accuse anyone. You're asking me to start looking. Yes. He stared at the paper bag in his hands. Sometimes looking costs more than a man can afford, Daniel said. So does pretending. Frank nodded slowly. I'll bring the statements tomorrow. Later that afternoon, Annie moved to purchase records while Claire joined a conference call. The first invoices were ordinary. Concrete, lumber, gloves, safety glasses. Then she found repeated charges for fall protection harnesses. 300 new units had been billed over 4 months. Annie opened the warehouse inventory. Only 46 were listed. She checked the side issue log. Crews were still using old harnesses with faded tags. When Claire returned, Annie showed her. Could the rest be stored somewhere else? Annie asked. Possibly. Can we check? Claire glanced toward Victor's office. We can. They walked to the supply yard and asked the warehouse clerk to show them the latest shipment. He led them past shelves of hard hats and rope to several boxes labeled with the supplier's name. Claire opened one. Inside were old harnesses. Some had frayed straps. Several metal clips had been repainted. New inspection labels had been attached over older ones. Annie lifted one carefully. This isn't new. The clerk looked toward the door. I only receive what they send. Who told you to store these as new? Claire asked. I don't know. You signed the receiving form. I was told to. By whom? Before he could answer, Victor entered. He took in the open boxes, the harness in Annie's hand, and the phone Claire had raised to take photographs. Put that down, he said. Annie did not move. Workers are wearing these. I said put it down. Claire photographed the torn strap. Why were used harnesses recorded as new? Victor looked at the warehouse clerk. Leave us. The man left at once. Victor closed the distance between himself and Annie. You are outside your assigned area. Claire brought me. I'm speaking to you. Annie placed the harness on the table. Then answer me. Would you wear this 10 floors up? Victor stared at her for a long moment. That is enough for today, he said. Go home. Annie looked at Claire. Claire shook her head. She stays. Victor's face changed. The professional calm remained.